Okay, we can get started now. I welcome you to the last Brownbag seminar of this calendar year, and it's my pleasure to present Samantha Guzman, who is a PhD researcher at the Historical Institute of the University of Bern. She's previously studied in a number of institutions, such as CEU in Budapest, at Maynooth University in Ireland, as well as in Idaho. And she's currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Southeast European Studies, and her research is focused on, and her presentation will focus on Albanian nationalist and political organizations in Central Europe over actually quite a long time span, from the late 60s, when we start seeing some first protest movements in Kosovo, until the war of 1998. So without further ado, I turn over to you, Samantha. I'm looking forward to the presentation.
All right, thank you, Florian, for your introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited to kind of present a little brief overview of my PhD dissertation and some of the research that I've conducted up to this point. So my dissertation serves as an organizational history of the prominent and oftentimes opposing Kosovo Albanian nationalist and political organizations, which formed in Central Europe in the latter half of the 20th century. And while the first half of my dissertation focuses on some of the earlier groups that were formed by Kosovo Albanians, the second half kind of tapers down to focus on two central formations. These are the Democratic League of Kosovo, also known as Lidia Demokratika I Kosovis, or the LDK, and the People's Movement of Kosovo, also known as Divizia Popolare I Kosovis, or the LPK. From here on out, I'll just call them the LPK and the Democratic League because the names are kind of similar. So. A central topic for discussion will include the role that these organizations played in either funding and recruiting for or preventing the formation of an armed resistance movement before the outbreak of the war in Kosovo in 1998. And some of my very main research questions include what were the core functions, goals, and ideologies of these organizations, and how did they change or develop over time? In what ways did these organizations align, and in what ways did they oppose each other? And what effect, if any, did these organizations have on creating significant political and social change in Kosovo? Ultimately, my dissertation will argue that over time, as peaceful initiatives and passive resistance failed, these organizations took part in a gradual and deliberate radicalization that promoted policies of violent resistance as a way to end the growing conflict in Kosovo in the 1990s. All right. Oops, sorry. So a little bit to cover the scope of my project, to kind of ask why Central Europe, why Kosovo Albanians, and why this specific time frame of 1968 to 1998. As Florian mentioned, it's a little bit longer. So as many of you know, if you are someone from Southeastern Europe, it is basically a guarantee that you have family connections or some kind of connection to Germany, Switzerland, or Austria. And whether it's a family member who moved abroad as a guest worker, one that migrated for family reunification, or in many recent cases, the family member or members were refugees or asylum seekers escaping conflict. Throughout the 20th century, there was a consistent and steady influx of individuals and later on families moving from Southeastern Europe to Western and Central Europe. And Kosovo Albanians made up a significant part of this migration. And as of 2019, it was estimated that around 200,000 ethnic Albanians live in Switzerland, making them the 5th largest group of foreigners living in Switzerland today. I myself, having lived in Switzerland for about 4 years now, have learned how kind of Balkan influence and culture is such a prominent part of Swiss society. And as you can see in the photo on the right, which is from a Balkan kind of restaurant that serves burek in Switzerland. They're celebrating their Swiss National Day. And yeah, so all it takes usually is just kind of a short walk to the closest restaurant or bakery to kind of find this influence. And as for my chosen time frame, 1968 as a starting point was an obvious choice for a number of reasons. As Florian mentioned, around this time, Yugoslavia had undergone a number of constitutional reforms and major political, social, and economic changes. Larger scale protests were taking place in Kosovo at this time, marking some of the political and social issues that were kind of starting to grow. And this time also kind of generally marked the start of a lot of guest worker agreements between Yugoslavia and West Germany and Yugoslavia and Switzerland. And I chose to end my dissertation in the year 1998 because, as I'll mention kind of later on in the presentation, this is when the organizations that I'm discussing either became kind of essentially obsolete, or they merged their leadership with militant groups such as the UÇK. Right. So kind of on my theory and methodology, I'll cover a little bit. So the organizations being discussed would not have come to fruition without the mobilization, involvement, and collective action of the Kosovo Albanian diaspora. And therefore, an interdisciplinary theoretical framework with perspectives on migration, diaspora, organizations, and mobilization is vital to my research. Well-known scholars such as Rogers Brubaker, Anthony D. Smith, Benedict Anderson have all formulated theories concerning the concepts of ethno-nationalism, diaspora involvement, long-distance nationalism, and the delocalization of conflicts. And these theories will be incorporated into the framework of the dissertation to help support the central argument. One intriguing theory concerning mobilization and political nationalist groups, which I believe can be applied to the Kosovo Albanian organizations, is from a book by Roger D. Peterson, which is called Resistance and Rebellion, Lessons from Eastern Europe. This was published in 2001. And Peterson argues that for any kind of social or nationalist resistance or rebellion to occur, a group of first actors must first incite resistance through their participation in low-risk actions, which could include vetoing elections, writing graffiti, or distributing pamphlets, propaganda, kind of political or nationalist materials. And eventually this builds into high risk and rebellious actions, which can include staging demonstrations or participating in rebellions, riots, etc. Peterson's work is particularly unique because it seeks to show how mobilization and involvement in social movements is not a static process, but rather a dynamic one that changes form over time. At this time, I'm still really working on building up a strong theoretical framework, and I do still have to look further into theories concerning collective action and organizational and group structures. So at the end of this presentation, if anyone has experience with concepts or theories of collective action, I would really appreciate hearing your thoughts and suggestions on how I could possibly incorporate this. And then for methodology, so I began work on this dissertation in June 2018. And as part of my doctoral research, I'm working as an assistant to Dr. Franziska Zaug on her habilitation project, which is titled A Long Durée of Violence, War Disrupted Societies in Southeast Europe, which is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. And working alongside this project has allowed me to carry out archival research at a number of institutions throughout Europe and the United States, as well as conducting interviews. And we're conducting interviews who are from Kosovo and have either lived or are currently living in Central European countries, mainly Germany and Switzerland. And between myself and Dr. Zog and our really wonderful assistant, Mavlana, we were able to conduct interviews in English, German, French, Serbo-Croatian, and or Albanian. And so the individual being interviewed was given the choice to speak in whatever language they felt most comfortable and most at ease. And one of the really incredible aspects of our interviews as well has been that not only do we have the privilege of hearing the personal spoken recollections from these individuals, but many of them also have personal access to kind of personal libraries and collections of photographs, newspapers, pamphlets, which they have, allowed us to look through. And along with this, many of them are also very talented writers and artists who have shared their experience and their personal writings and works with us as well. So some of the obstacles in my research come from the contemporary nature of the subject which I am researching. And it is often difficult to access documents and archival sources, and anyone who has conducted research in the Balkans kind of understands the varying levels of success that can come out of an archival research trip. And at the end of the day, it's a completely understandable obstacle because many of the people that I am researching are still alive and their identity and privacy, of course, have to be protected. So in the end, I'm using a lot of the interviews that we conducted as a way to kind of supplement any gaps that might exist in the archival sources. And just to kind of give a quick overview, I have visited, Archive Yugoslavia in Belgrade, which gave me pretty decent access to quite a few documents from around 1952 to 1972, as well as limited amount of documents on 1981 and the protests in Kosovo. I also visited the National Archives in Pristina and Kosovo. And again, it was a similar time frame of kind of late 1950s to early 1970s. And the rest of my research was mainly conducted throughout Central Europe, the Political Archive in Berlin, the Federal Archives in Bern, and also the Social Archives in Zurich, and the Diplomatic Archives Online, which is the Diplomatische Archiv, Diplomatische Dokumente der Schweiz, also known as DODIS, which is online. And those have all kind of given me different newspaper clippings, government views, discussions between embassies, diplomats, and foreign dignitaries, kind of discussing the relationship between Central Europe and Yugoslavia. So, all right. So to give a quick kind of intro to the divisions and phases that I'm discussing in my dissertation, I've just kind of outlined it really quickly on this slide. And to fully understand the Kosovo Albanian diaspora residing in Central Europe, one must first understand the driving factors and phases behind the migration of ethnic Albanians, which took place throughout the 20th century. Migration of Albanians from the former Yugoslavia, including, but of course not strictly limited to Kosovo Albanians, over to Central Europe, reached its height in the latter half of the 20th century. It has been frequently argued in recent scholarship that the migration process of these individuals can be seen as taking part in three distinct phases. The first phase began in the 1960s with the movement of temporary seasonal workers, also known in German as Gastarbeiter. The second phase was a result of economic stagnation and growing instability in Yugoslavia in the 1980s. And the third phase was marked by the mass influx of refugees and asylum seekers in the 1990s, before and during the outbreak of the war in Kosovo. And in my research, I have found that as a lot of the driving factors for migration changed, naturally so too did the organizational structure and the ideologies of those who were involved at the time. So to start with the first phase, we're beginning in the 1960s and 1970s. And this first phase of migration consisted namely of guest workers or Gastarbeiter who came from the former Yugoslavia and migrated on a temporary or seasonal basis to Western and Central European countries, particularly to Switzerland and West Germany. And this was generally for economic reasons. This phase was strongly defined by shifting socioeconomic policies, both in Yugoslavia and in Central Europe. And this was a result of the post-war need for economic reform and recovery. Temporary migration to countries such as West Germany and Switzerland was really appealing to Yugoslav nationals for several main reasons. First, West Germany and Switzerland were in close proximity to Yugoslavia. Second, there were more jobs available. And finally, wages in these countries were significantly higher. And in November 1963, the Ministry of Labor in Belgrade announced that it would allow workers from Yugoslavia to seek temporary employment in countries such as West Germany and Switzerland. And the Yugoslav regime made it clear that these permissions would mainly be offered almost exclusively to unskilled workers, and that only in, quote, exceptional cases would skilled and highly skilled workers be allowed to leave the country. Despite this initially somewhat open approach towards labor migration, it wasn't long before the general concerns about the guest workers' activities abroad developed kind of into an essential full-blown paranoia for state authorities of the Yugoslav government. Therefore, in order to maintain some semblance of control over Yugoslav nationals, it was decided that they would establish and encourage the involvement of individuals in Gastarbeiter clubs and organizations throughout West Germany and Switzerland. These clubs were usually founded or established by companies employing them or by the workers themselves, whereas the state tried to assist their opening and functioning through financial and logistical support. By infiltrating its members in the clubs, they hope to channel the political orientation of, quote, passive workers in the positive direction without an explicit party involvement. And during this first period of migration, the Gastarbeiter clubs were not necessarily divided along ethnic lines until the 1970s. And additionally, statements concerning precise origins and ethnic divisions among Yugoslav migrants are unfortunately not made very clear throughout much of the available sources. And most of the documents from this period, they're usually kind of descriptively merged into one single category, the workers at this time, and were usually referred to just as Yugoslavs, Yugoslav guest workers. And during the 1960s and 70s, there are mentions of ethnic Albanians and Yugoslav Albanians, but these mentions are kind of made sparingly, and it's usually in a kind of less than positive manner. So it should be noted that towards the end of the 1970s, the majority of Albanian-speaking migrants from Yugoslavia were guest workers who were from rural areas. They had minimal schooling and they were not outwardly engaged in politics, which had a really kind of widespread effect on these early organizations. And following the arrival of kind of the first figures of the Albanian nationalist movement in Switzerland, they realized that in order to pursue their struggle, they first needed to sensitize their co-nationals, and this meant making them understand that the situation of Albanians in Yugoslavia, was an issue, and they felt they needed to convince them of the injustices committed against them and work to show and find a solution. All right, and then for the second division, which is the 1980s, similar to the first phase in the 1960s and 70s, the second phase of migration of Yugoslav Albanians was also economic in nature, and was a result of the economic stagnation in Yugoslavia, which followed Josip Broz Tito's death in May 1980. However, protests, demonstrations, and unrest had also been gaining momentum during this time, and therefore this phase consisted not only of laborers, but also of individuals who were trying to avoid arrest and political repression. So 3 of the earlier nationalist groups, which were established in Central Europe by Kosovo Albanians, included the Red Popular Front, also known as the FKP, the National Liberation Movement of Kosovo and Albanian lands in Yugoslavia, and the Organization of Marxist-Leninists of Kosovo, or the OMLK. And these were all formed in Central Europe. The FKP, I have a little chart right here to help out. So the FKP was established in West Germany in 1978 by Ibrahim Kelmendi, who had gone into exile in 1976. When he was banned from studying after taking part in a demonstration. The National Liberation Movement was also created in West Germany by Kosovo Albanian exiles and brothers, Yusuf and Bardosh Garvala in 1979. And finally, the OMLK was formed in Switzerland in 1979 with Kadri Zeka acting as the main representative. Nationalist leaders and groups often organized events for the local Albanian community abroad to help gain support for their cause. For example, Kadri Zeka and the Gavrila brothers regularly held gatherings that celebrated their ethnic Albanian identity and promoted independence for Kosovo. This could include anything from Albanian folk music concerts, Albanian Flag Day celebrations, and coffee house poetry readings and political discussions. And ideologies and goals varied among these early groups, with some of them holding kind of a stronger Marxist ideology than others, and some believing that union with Albania would be a viable way to resolve the Kosovo issue of status and autonomy. However, some overlaps did exist, and it was decided in 1982, as you can see kind of this merging on the slide, that the groups would better serve the cause of self-determination and independence for Kosovo by joining together and creating a single, stronger organization. Efforts to merge the groups were advanced by the Gavrila brothers and Kadri Zeka, and then delayed following their assassination in Untergruppenbach, Germany in 1982. However, after this setback, a series of meetings and negotiations took place, and the 3 groups merged into a singular organization, which is also known as La Vizia Popolare per Republican I Kosovis, the LPRK, or the Popular Movement for the Republic of Kosovo. And in 1991, they removed the Republic part. And although the core ideologies stayed the same, the name was just shortened a bit. So leaders and members of the LPK sought to obtain independence for Kosovo and possible union with Albania through a variety of measures and strategies. In the early 1980s, the Graz brothers had helped to establish the illegal press in the Federal Republic of Germany. And they began printing the newspaper Zari Kosovis, which is the voice of Kosovo. And following the death of the Graz brothers, Skender Dermishi took over the editing. And then in 1983, the paper, the publishing was moved over to Switzerland. And from there, Jafar Shatri acted as the main editor. The purpose of this newspaper, aside from serving as the central organ of the LPK, was to keep members of the organization informed about meetings, provide updates on the situation in Kosovo, commemorate important holidays or historic events, and discuss generally how individuals could offer their assistance to the cause. And one of the main forms of assistance that the clandestine press called for was private monetary donations from members of the diaspora. And as a way to handle this pretty mass influx of money that was coming in, the LPK established the Homeland is Calling Fund in Switzerland in 1993. And here on this slide, I have one of the original newspaper clips from Zari Kosovis, and it's the one on the right. And it's kind of listing the different countries and the bank account details of where it can make deposits. And on the left is a newspaper clipping from Le Temps in Switzerland. And it's kind of discussing how a lot of the Kosovo Albanians are setting up kind of reserve finances in Switzerland. So funds to support armed resistance were largely coming from Europe, mainly from densely populated Kosovo Albanian communities in the Swiss cantons of Geneva, Zurich, Vaud, and Bern, and the Western German states of Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, Berlin, and North Rhine-Westphalia. Switzerland served as the ideal center for the Homeland is Calling Fund and other funding organizations, namely because of the security and anonymity which was guaranteed for customers of the Swiss banks. Switzerland also had the distinct benefit when it came to raising funds because Kosovo Albanian refugees in Switzerland had the right to work, which was not allowed for refugees at the time in Western Germany. And so essentially the Kosovo Albanians in Switzerland had a little bit more money at their disposal for donating. In one specific case that was particularly interesting with some individuals that we interviewed, the LPK actually enlisted the help of 2 Swiss citizens to manage bank accounts and funds and send money to Kosovo when it was requested. And this collaboration was really unique because much of the diaspora generally kind of excluded individuals who were not ethnic Kosovo or ethnic Albanians or from Kosovo from playing such a kind of like a vital and really central role in the organization. Despite this organizational exclusivity, donations to the Homeland is Calling Fund could be accepted from anyone though. And donating money was really as simple as walking into any bank where the Homeland is Calling Fund had an account. And like I said, it's shown in that kind of right advertisement. So the Homeland is Calling Fund was among the most prominent fundraising organizations from the Kosovo Albanian diaspora. However, it was not the sole organization that existed before and during the outbreak of the war in Kosovo. And numerous other funding organizations were also present in Switzerland and Germany, vying for resources and working in direct opposition to other funds at some times. Leaders of the funding organizations remained generally vague and somewhat tight-lipped about where the money being raised from the diaspora ended up. However, despite this kind of lack of clarity, the members of the Kosovo Albanian diaspora really enthusiastically donated funds to the various organizations. And it was found that the average contribution from a Kosovo Albanian family was around 50 to 170 US dollars per month. So the Democratic League of Kosovo, which I mentioned earlier, acted as the dominant political force within Kosovo through the first half of the 1990s. And it was established in December 1989, and led by Ibrahim Rugova, who was clandestinely elected as president of Kosovo in 1992. And the Democratic League built themselves upon a political platform that condemned armed resistance and really emphasized the use of nonviolent civil resistance against the Serbian regime to obtain independence for Kosovo. Although Ibrahim Rugova and his followers, who were called the Peaceful Path institutionalists, were primarily based within the confines of the region of Kosovo, both Rugova and a lot of his supporters did function to a limited extent and had a number of representatives in place in Central Europe, in countries such as West Germany and Switzerland. And Rugova did recognize the need for international support and saw that, quote, the Albanian diaspora was surely a crucial factor in ensuring that enough financial resources would come through for the survival of Albanian parallel institutions set up in Kosovo, end quote. All right, I'm seeing I'm getting close on time, so I'll try and wrap it out here. So despite this kind of initial growth in popularity and support over time, Rugova's status as a political leader somewhat weakened, and his staunch adherence to civil resistance came under severe criticism from many Kosovo Albanian politicians, scholars, and activists. And many scholars and analysts have argued that Rugova's greatest kind of political mistake happened in 1995 when he failed to obtain any kind of recognition about the growing conflict at the Dayton Accords. And while this is considered one of his more kind of notable blunders, this was paired with several other events which resulted in his kind of decline of political favor and public support. So kind of to summarize really quickly, in the 1990s, Kosovo Albanian migrants who were living abroad and were involved in political or nationalist causes were generally divided along two distinct ideological lines. And although these groups were both essentially nationalist oriented and struggling for the long-term goal of independence for Kosovo, the two groups did differ quite a bit in their approaches and means being applied to achieve this goal. The first group, also known as the Peaceful Path institutionalists, placed much of their support behind President Ibrahim Rugova and the political party which he led. And Rugova and the LDK, or the Democratic League, maintained kind of a really strict adherence to nonviolent resistance as their main political tool. And on the opposing side, those in favor of armed resistance over time placed their trust in the Popular Movement for Kosovo, or the LPK, and later merging this with some of the individuals who made up the Kosovo Liberation Army, or the UÇK. The LPK and its followers believed that Rugova's passive political ideology had led to the Kosovo issue really being ignored by the international community at Dayton. And so they really believed that their only option left was some kind of armed action against the Serbian government. And both the LPK and LDK had established organizations in Switzerland and Germany. However, the Popular Movement for Kosovo, the LPK, had a kind of longer tradition of activism in Central Europe and did not kind of officially operate within Kosovo. The LPK was frequently overshadowed by the Democratic League, since many European countries refused to recognize or support the organization. However, many Kosovo Albanians who had initially supported the Democratic League gradually began to change their loyalties when they realized that passive resistance was not resolving the growing conflict in Kosovo. And ultimately, as Serbian repression increased, with beatings of Albanians and prison sentences without trial, Mr. Rugova's insistence on nonviolence seemed less and less appealing. So yeah, that is my presentation. I hope I didn't go too over time. And I look forward to hearing any questions or comments as well.
Great, thank you so much for this presentation. And so yes, we open the floor for questions and comments on all of that. So who would like to go first? Again, as usual, anybody is able to raise their hand. Yeah, Nejmuddin, you go ahead. You can turn on your camera and your microphone. We don't see you or hear you.
Hello?
Yes, now we hear you. Just turn on your camera as well. That would be great if you can manage.
Professor, I'm outside, so
okay.
I would like...
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I would like just only to ask about the LPK, how it was formed, because almost we know that the brothers Garwala and Kadri Zeka were the first owners or formers of LPK, but do you have any data of the foundation Levizia threat, Vendinja threat, which means the motherland calls? Because as I have seen that the foundation, I mean, in the literature, everywhere where I found every Albanian were able to give 3% of their incomes in the Switzerland to give that monies for the Kosovo. And also another question, which is really important, do you believe that just only Albanians from Kosovo were a part of LPK? Because we have almost really public figures, which they are also in the government in Macedonia now, which they were members of LPK organization. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Nejmuddin. Samantha, would you mind taking a couple of questions because we have quite a few hands up, or would you want to answer those first?
Is it okay if I go one at a time? I'm just
sure. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll answer quick. Yeah. Thank you for your question. No, so the Homeland Calls Fund is the fund that you mentioned. It's just there are a lot of varying translations, and so sometimes it's Homeland is calling, Fatherland calls, Motherland calls, but it's essentially the same fund. And the if I can go back, yes, this display on the right you'll see is Vendinja threat, which is Homeland is calling. So it's just kind of a matter of translations. But as I said, this wasn't the only fund that was also in existence, and it kind of became a pattern throughout quite a few of these funds that cropped up, that they set as a baseline 3% of the annual salary. And so it was pretty kind of like a common thread throughout a lot of these groups. But yeah, that's the same one that you mentioned. And as for involvement in groups, you were absolutely right that it was not just Kosovo Albanians that were involved in these groups. I believe, so Ibrahim Kilmendi, I'm not quite sure. I know he did end up in Macedonia at some point. I'm not sure if he was ethnic Albanian that was originally from Macedonia or Kosovo, but he did end up in Macedonia at one point, and he was one of the founding leaders. And there is quite a bit of involvement from Macedonian Albanians. But as I mentioned kind of earlier in the presentation, the problem is a lot of the governments from Switzerland and Germany, they don't recognize a lot of the ethnic divisions, and it's really problematic. And they kind of were just grouping them as all ethnic Albanians or all Yugoslav Albanians. And so finding those distinctions can be kind of a bit difficult to navigate. And so yeah, you're absolutely right that there was kind of an involvement in basis in Macedonia as well.
Thanks. Let's stick to our Macedonian contingent of questions. Igor Poptraikov. Igor, go ahead.
Yes, what is the role of Bernard Kouchner in this financing program? Do you find any linkages of financing with the Royal Emirates Arab family and the Prince Faisal, who lives on an island in Greece, and what is the connection of Bernard Kouchner with the Kouchner family, which is related with Donald Trump now?
Okay, thank you. I think we can maybe take another question because we have just so many. So we'll take Lura.
Oh, yeah.
Lura Polajani. Go ahead, Lura.
Hi. Thanks for your presentation, Samantha. It was very informative, and you definitely kind of shared a lot of information on very kind of broad time space. So good for you for managing. So my questions will be actually more theoretical, because you started with theory, and then I was missing some of the reflection of what this could mean if we join theory and empirical data. So one is, since you mentioned, I'm very excited that you're thinking of using a social movement kind of theoretical framework, but I was wondering how you treat is it these kind of different clusters? Do you look at all of this as some sort of transnational movement? Because that would be interesting, but I'm just wondering, since you're looking at migration groups and then domestic groups, are we or have you noticed any form of network? Because of course, like with social movements, networks are everything. And I think it's always very interesting, especially in the Kosovo case, that you have so many different networks that are so interconnected that although you have these two groups that you're looking at, their networks were the same. In different points in history, even the people in these two different groups are the same people. You know, they switch back and forth, but basically it's the same kind of guys, and they're still, because I also saw a question about whether women were involved, and sadly women were, they were involved, but they were always left like in the lower kind of underground part of the movement. So basically I would really want to know a bit more of your reflection of how what this means in terms of how are you going to merge these migrant groups that you're looking at, and then what happened in Kosovo, because I was missing that a little bit. And another thing that's more of a comment, but on something I was missing, but then maybe you have it already in your research, but then you didn't include it because of time, but it's the issue of state policies. So we're looking, I mean, from the presentation, we were constantly looking at how these movements evolved, but these movements didn't evolve in a vacuum, right? They evolved certain ways because state policies developed in certain ways. There was a reason why Rugova was being non-violent in the beginning, and then there's a reason why more of a kind of violent story developed. Many things to do with, one, Kosovo didn't have an army yet, so it took a while for that to develop, right? But two, it's also the way that, you know, Slobodan Milosevic and his regime developed over time. So I was missing that a little bit, and I was wondering whether there is a correlation between state policies, or is this more of an independent kind of development? But yeah, anyways, yeah, I'm very excited about your research, and I look forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Thanks, Laura.
Perfect. Is it okay if I answer the questions of?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you both for your comments and your questions. And Igor, unfortunately, I have no knowledge of this family, but it sounds incredibly interesting. But yeah, I really didn't have much awareness out of funding that was kind of happening outside of the United States and Europe. So that would be a really kind of interesting connection to make, because yeah, I didn't know the connection before, and yeah, it would kind of be interesting because a lot of ethnic Albanians belong to Islamic religion, the Muslim faith, and so I'm kind of wondering if there's that connection where yeah, when you get countries in the Middle East kind of involved, if that's the tie, and if they see it as the connection, it'd be really interesting to look further into it. So sorry, I was like, I couldn't answer more of it. And then to go to kind of Laura's sets of questions. So as I've gone through this, it's really been hard to, I almost want to go from kind of like calling this a history of organizations to just calling it a history of disorganization, because as you mentioned, it's, you know, it is transnational in nature. There's so many networks making this up, and you do see so many repeated figures kind of just changing loyalties and involvement towards the group to like a limited extent. It's really interesting. And yeah, there's so many repetitions throughout history and familiar figures that kind of pop up again and again. And so I'm still, like I said, I'm still really working on, and I'm very new to this kind of idea of collective actions and social movements. And I did have a little experience writing on social movements in Kosovo for one of my master's dissertations, my master's thesis. But it's something I still really need to look into. And I'm still, as I go, kind of figuring out day by day how incredibly complex these networks are, and how interwoven they are, and at the same time how distinct and unique kind of each grouping was. And as for kind of your comment on state policies affecting development, I really do think that these state policies did have an effect, because in the 1960s and 1970s, it was fairly easy for an individual to be deported just for kind of what they called misconduct, which I didn't know what the limitations of this would be. And so they weren't so politically oriented at the time, even though quite a bit was going on in Kosovo. And it was gradually over time, as they became more and more settled in Central Europe, through family reunification, and a lot of these policies that allowed settlement, that they kind of became more active, it seems. Again, it's just a hunch, and I'm still working on it. But yeah, it's definitely something I'm gonna keep looking into of this effect. So.
Great, thanks. So we have Franziska Zauk as next, who we've already heard about. So
yeah, my boss.
Hello to everybody. Thank you so much, Samantha, for your very interesting insight in your current state of research. It's always interesting to see how it's developing. Yeah, I was a bit shocked from my distant point of view today about the picture of the official bulletin of Switzerland on Kosovars, and about the way Switzerland represents the Kosovars in this official way. And I mean, the front page appears as an association of football fans, hooligans, bald heads, in short, of nationalistic young men who are often in the press in Switzerland as delinquents. And can you say something about how and when the image of Yugoslavs in Switzerland, to which Kosovo people still belonged until the 1990s, has changed?
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely.
Should I? Maybe we can get another question in, because we have quite a few more questions, if that's okay. We have Aida Ibricevic. Do you want to go ahead, Aida?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for a great presentation, Samantha. My question is a little bit outside of the scope of your presentation, but I think I think it's fair, because you have been conducting interviews and you have been doing field work. So my question is, to what extent does this history, which you presented in these three phases of the workings of these two organizations, affect today's diaspora voting of Kosovo Albanians in the countries that you have been doing field work in. You talked about ideological differences between the organizations. As far as I understood from you, you were just talking about their attitudes or their changing attitude towards use of violence. Now, can you please comment on other ideological differences aside of this one, which maybe I just misunderstood you from your presentation? And also, how is it that these organizations affect external voting of Kosovo Albanians in the countries where you have done field work today? Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't you go ahead with those two questions, and then we have a last final round afterwards.
Okay, yeah, to answer Francisca's question first. So I pulled up the picture of this. It's I'm not sure, like it's kind of like a government report or pamphlet that Switzerland created, I believe in 2009. This was published, and I really do want to meet the individual who came up with the cover of this for the really like central Adidas product placement for one thing. But as far as kind of the images changed about Kosovo Albanians in Switzerland, it's tricky because I'm still very much an outsider in Swiss society, but in the beginning, with a lot of the diplomatic documents I was looking at, they were seen hugely as kind of troublemakers. And that's what I said, when distinctions weren't really made of the different ethnicities, except for very rarely. And a lot of the time it was just kind of blaming them for causing a lot of trouble. And yeah, it really wasn't kind of a positive reflection from the government. But over time, I think that people are kind of like starting to like reflect and realize that a lot of the Kosovo Albanian community, along with a lot of other people from the Balkans, are such an integral part of Swiss society. And yeah, it's I really don't know much more I can say on it. I'm sorry. But yeah, I really see them as being such an integral and really like integrated part of Swiss society that a lot of differentiation isn't made. So I hope that answers a little bit. And so as for the other question, let's see. So how has kind of like this diaspora involvement affected voting in Kosovo? Now, it's because we did have the recent vote in Kosovo last year, it's a little bit hard to gauge because there was distinct increased involvement from a lot of Kosovo Albanians coming from Central Europe and actually traveling home so they could vote. And now they have someone who's at a very high place in the government as well, who has spent a considerable amount of time in Switzerland. And so this has definitely had a major effect. But I would be really interested to kind of see how voting is affected outside of kind of this like this COVID bubble, sadly, because I think a lot of more people would have been willing to get involved, but yeah, of course there were restrictions at the time. And so yeah, it's definitely had a distinct effect. You see young individuals from the Kosovo Albanian diaspora really wanting to like kind of reconnect with Kosovar society and get involved. And they're also kind of looking back at the effect that past movements have had. And so I think this had a really positive effect of kind of like having like involvement in Switzerland, but also looking kind of like to Kosovo to be involved as well. So it's kind of yeah, a transnational involvement, which is really interesting. So yeah, and then as far as kind of a lot of the ideological differences between the LPK and the Democratic League. So the nonviolent resistance, the passive resistance was kind of a major one. But kind of the outside perspective of these groups is also important, I would argue. And that brings in kind of this idea of international legitimacy, which was really important at the time. It was sadly, you know, a lot of like how these groups saw themselves didn't really reach a lot of kind of the government perspectives. And so a lot of the time it kind of came down to which of these groups a lot of the international governments were willing to recognize as legitimate. And usually that favor did go more towards the Democratic League. And Ibrahim Rugova really tried to kind of show over time to the international community the worth that Kosovo had and would have as an independent republic. And the popular movement for Kosovo, the LPK, wasn't always as successful as kind of gaining this international legitimacy. And so that's where a lot of the differences kind of arose. So
thanks. If there's no other question, I would be interested actually in that ideological question, because I mean those movements were quite Marxist and communist also in the at least until early 1990s. I mean, there's been some studies on this LPK and they're kind of even, you know, Hoxhaite kind of ideology. So I'm just kind of wondering, I mean, it always struck me as very bizarre that they would have this strange, you know, Marxist ideology while sitting in the diaspora in Germany and Switzerland. I mean, of course, some did go to Albania, but they were usually arrested by Hoxha when they got there. So it's kind of just wondering, how did they, you know, what kind of vision of Kosovo did they have? And was it, you know, was it Marxist because the only alternative was Albania and thus it was Marxist by default? Or was there kind of could you detect an active Marxist ideology in thinking about not the national side, which is clear, but the kind of the Marxist side of the story, so to speak?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a really good point. And yeah, to kind of go back to the previous question as well, that is kind of like one of the big ideological differences as well, is the Democratic League never really supported union with Albania as a solution. It really, I think they thought it would be kind of too much to ask for from the international community at the time. And so they really tried to steer away from that as much as possible. Like I said, to kind of gain international legitimacy, which for anyone that knows US history, they were not the biggest fans of Marxism, socialism. So that wouldn't have appealed to them at the time. And I think the LPK was definitely more, especially in the early years of its formation, was definitely more geared towards union with Albania. And I think that's kind of where, like you said, the default to Marxism did kind of fall in at that point, because with Enver Hoxha in place at the time, you know, he was really kind of an admirable and almost a mythical figure for them. We interviewed a few individuals who really kind of initially believed in this idea of like union with Albania, but they hadn't actually even been to Albania and they weren't allowed to go. And one of them, once he actually did get to go to Albania in the early 1980s, he was really disenchanted, you know, because before he'd only been hearing over the radio kind of like what a paradise it was and what Enver Hoxha had brought to benefit the country. And it was more of kind of an exchange of ideas. But when an actual physical exchange started happening, you know, it was lessened. So yeah, that is one of the kind of main ideological differences between the two groups.
Thanks. I mean, I think this, I mean, the interesting paradox of being, you know, a diaspora in a capitalist country and advocating for Marxism in Yugoslavia, you know, in Kosovo with Albanian unification, just strikes me as one of those kind of strange paradoxes. But thanks. I think we're out of time. Thank you so much for your presentation. You've really done a tour de force over 30 years of these movements, and so it's been very insightful. And we wish you all the best of luck with your research and your PhD. So thank you, and thanks to all the audience for the questions. There is the open question from Nera about women's, the role of women, but I think Laura has addressed it indirectly, but that's also, of course, an interesting dimension of the role of women, women in these movements. But I presume they probably were fairly marginalized, as Laura was suggesting.
Yeah, they absolutely were. And we have been able to interview a couple of women that were involved, but yeah, they were very marginalized, and a lot of them weren't able to make it over to Central Europe, where it wasn't necessarily much freer to kind of support these movements and have an organization. But a lot of them didn't make it over to Central Europe until late 1970s, early 1980s, 1990s, when family reunification was taking place. So yeah, a lot of their involvement was really clandestine, and it's definitely something I would love to learn more about, their involvement. So
great. So questions remain open. Thank you so much. Thanks to the audience, and see you in January for our next Brownbag seminar.
all right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.